The desert sun had no mercy that day. It burned over the town of San Perdido, a place forgotten by maps and remembered only by the ghosts buried behind the old chapel. Dust rolled through the streets like tired travelers, and the wind carried whispers of things that should have been left buried. Inside Cantina del Sol, the piano stood silent, its keys yellowed like old teeth. The few men drinking kept their eyes low, no one wanted trouble. But trouble had a way of finding people who thought tight escaped ET. At the far end of the bar sat a man the locals called Don Mateo Vargas, a gray-haired cowboy with hands that trembled only when he wasn't holding a gun. He wore a faded poncho, his head pulled low, and his boots looked like tight walked through every sin a man could commit. Nobody knew where he came from anymore. They just knew that, long ago, he'd stopped shooting. That's when the Pistolero came. Strich. The provocation. He wrote in fast, young, proud, wild, the kind of man who'd never buried a friend. They called him El Tigre, a name he'd earned by gunning down 3 bounty hunters before breakfast in Santa Fe. His revolver was polished, his eyes arrogant, and his words sharp enough to draw blood. When he pushed through the swinging doors, the cantina fell silent. He saw the old man at the end of the bar and smirked. "Así eres el legendario Don Mateo Vargas," he mocked. "They say you used to be the deadliest shot in the frontier." Don Mateo didst look up. "Used to be," he muttered. "But time puts even the fastest draw to sleep. El tigre lauquet, loud and cruel. Sleep? Or maybe just scared? They say you hung up your gun because your hand shakes now." The bar tensed. Everyone knew the stories, how Don Mateo had once shot 5 men in a single breath, how he'd walked away from the Mexican War with a bullet still lodged in his ribs. He had nothing to prove. But pride is a dangerous animal, especially when cornered by youth. "I came to see if the stories are true," El Tigre said, stepping closer. "I want to see the man who killed legends." Mateo finally turned his eyes up. They were tired, but they carried the weight of 1,000 sunrises and regrets. "Go home, muchacho," he said softly. "Ain't nothing here worth dying for." The young gunman sneered. "Maybe not for you, Viejo. But for me, everything's worth proving." He reached for his gun. Strich. The old Vaquero's hand. The air froze. The barkeep ducked behind the counter. 1 second, 2. The metallic click echoed through the cantina. But it wasn't El Tigre's revolver that cleared leather first. It was Mateo's. A single shot split the silence. El Tigre's head flew off his head, a bullet hole clean through the brim. "Next one goes through your skull," Mateo said quietly, lowering his weapon. "Now, sit down." For a long moment, no one breathed. El Tigre's fingers twitched, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You didst shoot to kill," he spat. "You're nothing but a ghost, Viejo." Mateo sighed. "Ghosts don't miss." Then, with surprising strength, he slammed the barrel of his Colt into the young man's chest. "You think being deadly makes you strong? No. It makes you alone." El Tigre stumblit back, glaring. But something in the old Hmong eyes, something like sorrow, made him hesitate. Strich. The weight of a past. That night, El Tigre didst leave town. Instead, he sat outside the cantina, nursing his pride in a bottle of whiskey. The stars over San Perdido glittered cold, like the barrel of a gun aimed at heaven. Mateo came out after closing, boots crunching on gravel. "Still here?" he asked. The young gunman didst look up. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone." Mateo shrugged. "Better embarrassed than buried." El Tigre took a long swig. "You think you're better than me?" "No," Mateo said quietly. "I just lived long enough to see where your road ends." He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the scar that ran across his jaw. "I was like you once. Fussed, proud, foolish. Thought I could kill my way into respect. But all I found was emptiness." El Tigre frowned. "Then why stop me? Let me make my own mistakes." Mateo looked toward the desert, where the moon painted the dunes silver. "Because someone once stopped me. And I never thanked her." Strich. The woman from Sonora. He told his story slowly, the way old men tell truths TV hidden too long. Her name was Lucia, a widow from Sonora who'd lost everything in a raid. She'd found Mateo bleeding in the dust after one of his many duels, patched him up, fed him, and called him mi hijo perdido, my lost son. She taught me something no bullet ever could, he said. That a man can kill a dozen enemies and still lose to his own heart. El Tigre listened, silent now. What happened to her, he asked. Mateo's voice cracked. I left. Chasing a bounty. When I came back, her home was gone, burnt by bandits. I found her locket in the ashes. Since that day, I swore never to draw my gun unless it was to save a life. He looked at El Tigre. That's what you reminded me of tonight. The boy I used to be, the one she tried to save. Strich. The redemption. Days passed. San Perdido slowly forgot the fight, but El Tigre didst. He started following Mateo around, first out of pride, then out of curiosity, and finally, respect. He watched the old man mend fences for widows, share his food with orphans, and spent nights repairing the church roof without anyone asking. Mateo was no saint, but every act whispered redemption. Why do you help them? El Tigre asked one day. Because I can, Mateo said. That's reason enough. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, bandits. A dozen men, armed and drunk, riding hard toward San Perdido. The sheriff was out of town. Panic rippled through the village. El Tigre looked at Mateo. You gonna run, Viejo? Mateo shook his head. No. But this time, I won't be alone. Strich. The fight for San Perdido. The two men took positions on the edge of town, one young, one old, guarding the people who had once feared them both. El Tigre's heart pounded. Mateo's was steady. When the bandits arrived, chaos erupted, bullets flying, horses screaming, women praying. Mateo moved with the grace of a man who had seen too much death to be afraid of it anymore. Every shot he fired protected someone. El Tigre fought beside him, and for the first time, he wasn't shooting to prove himself, he was shooting to save. When the dust settled, 6 bandits lay dead. The rest fled into the desert, leaving behind silence and smoke. Mateo sat down, his hand bleeding from a graze. El Tigre knelt beside him. You did it, Viejo. You saved them. Mateo smiled faintly. No, muchacho. We did. Strich. The real lesson. As dawn broke, the townsfolk gathered around the two men. For the first time, they looked at El Tigre not as a killer but as a protector. Mateo placed his hand on the young man's shoulder. Now you understand, he said softly. The gun does and make the man. What he defends does. El Tigre swallowed hard. And you, what will you do now? Mateo gazed toward the rising sun. Rest. My fight's over. Moments later, his body slumped slightly. El Tigre caught him, panic in his eyes. Viejo. Mateo. The old man smiled faintly, whispering, tell them. Lucia was right. And with that, the last gunslinger of San Perdido took his final breath. Strich. The legacy. Months later, San Perdido had changed. The town that once feared violence now lived under peace, guarded by the very men who once sought blood. El Tigre never called himself that again. He hung Mateo's old poncho behind the church door and took a job fixing fences, training young boys to write, teaching them that courage wasn't about killing but protecting. Every night, he'd sit outside the cantina with 2 glasses, one for himself, one for the man who taught him what it meant to be human. He often whispered to the wind, Gracias, Viejo. You woke something better in me. Strich. The epilogue, the wind remembers. Years passed. Travelers passing through San Perdido spoke of a legend, an old gunslinger who came back from the dead, just long enough to save his town and a lost soul. Some swore that on quiet nights, when the moon was high and the desert was still, you could hear the faint echo of a gunshot and an old man's voice saying, Don't waste your life proving you're dangerous. Prove you can care. And every time the wind carried that whisper across the sands, someone somewhere, perhaps another angry young man, paused before drawing his gun. Because the frontier had learned one final truth. The most lethal men aren't the ones who kill the fastest, but the ones who choose not to. Strich. Gebrochenes Herz funkeln Moral Message. Violence may build fear, but only compassion builds peace. The true strength of a man lies not in the steadiness of his hand but in the gentleness of his heart.